Are you okay?
I'm okay.
I'm ready to cry.
You know I can't get out of my head.
I know. Listen.
It just doesn't stop. I'm a teenage girl. I'm also a soccer player. I'm also an artist. I'd like to think I'm funny.
Jazz Jennings was once hailed as a trailblazer, a symbol of courage and progress in a world slowly awakening to transgender visibility. From viral interviews to reality TV fame, she seemed unstoppable, a shining example of affirmation and hope. But behind the applause, a more complex, painful truth was unfolding. What happens when a child is made into a movement before they've even had a chance to simply be a child? This is the story of the life we watched, and the truths we may have missed. Jazz was born in 2000 in South Florida, assigned male at birth, but from an extraordinarily early age, she knew who she was. At just 2 years old, she voiced her truth. "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I am definitely a girl." Her insistence was unwavering, even as her parents, Greg and Jeanette, initially wondered if it was simply a phase. Yet the intensity of Jazz's feelings only grew. The tears that came with wearing boys' clothing, the anguish over being called the wrong name. These were more than simple childhood struggles. They were a declaration of identity, and they demanded a response. By age 5, Jazz's social transition was complete. She wore girls' clothing, had long hair, and insisted on being called Jazz. Her identity, for all intents and purposes, was being affirmed. But this private family decision was soon destined to become a public phenomenon, launching her into a spotlight few children or their families are prepared to face. In 2007, Jazz appeared on ABC's 2020 with Barbara Walters. At just 6 years old, she spoke about her gender identity with clarity that left the nation both amazed and divided. Some applauded her family for their courage and compassion, while others accused them of pushing a child into a rigid label far too early. That moment didn't just introduce Jazz to the world. It marked the start of a cultural debate, a discussion about gender, childhood, and identity that would grow more intense each year. Behind the cameras, however, a more complicated story was unfolding. Jazz Jennings, Jazz's mother, became a central force in her life. Protective, determined, and deeply involved, she managed every aspect of her daughter's public persona. From interviews to speaking tours to overseeing the production of I Am Jazz, Jeanette ensured that Jazz was always presented as a success story. But this careful orchestration raised questions. Was this support, or was it something more? Was Jazz being allowed to grow, or was she performing an identity crafted for public consumption? As Jazz approached puberty, her journey took a medical turn that would be both groundbreaking and controversial. At age 11, under the guidance of doctors, Jazz began taking puberty blockers, medications designed to pause the natural onset of puberty and prevent the development of male secondary sex characteristics. To her family and physicians, these blockers were a way to protect Jazz from the trauma of a body that did not align with her gender identity. To the medical and advocacy communities, they were a progressive affirmation of a child's autonomy. But beneath the surface, doubts lingered. Could someone so young truly comprehend the long-term consequences of halting natural development? Would pausing puberty also freeze emotional and psychological growth? Jazz's voice on the outside remained cheerful and confident, but privately, she began to struggle. She recorded video diaries in which she admitted, at times with unsettling honesty, "I feel like I'm living a lie. I don't feel like me." These words revealed a tension between public perception and private reality, a gap that would only widen in the years to come. The narrative of Jazz Jennings, the happy, articulate, precociously wise child who seemed to thrive under national attention, was powerful but incomplete. For every moment of triumph, there were quiet hours of uncertainty, of questioning, of growing pressure to embody the image the world had crafted for her. The cameras captured the public victories, but the private struggles remained largely hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. This was the paradox of Jazz's life. She was pioneering visibility for transgender youth, yet in doing so, she was also navigating the uncharted territory of childhood under a microscope. Every decision, every procedure, every public appearance was scrutinized. The lines between support and control, between protection and performance, became increasingly blurred. And as the years progressed, the weight of expectation, the burden of being both a child and a cultural symbol, would exact a profound cost. By the time Jazz Jennings reached early adolescence, the world already knew her story. She wasn't just a child anymore, she was a symbol. Every smile, every interview, every public appearance carried the weight of an entire movement. And yet, beneath the polished exterior, Jazz was beginning to confront questions that no one had asked her. Questions that went beyond gender and identity, questions that reached deep into her own sense of self. The puberty blockers, introduced at age 11, were a pivotal moment. Medically, they were intended to pause the natural development of male secondary sex characteristics, voice deepening, facial hair, and genital growth. To her family and doctors, they were a shield against the trauma of a body misaligned with her identity. To advocates, they were a triumph of early intervention. But for Jazz, they became something more complicated. They were both a gift and a burden, a physical pause that came with an emotional and psychological cost no one had fully measured. As her body froze in time, Jazz's life continued in front of cameras, interviews, and reality TV crews. I Am Jazz followed her everywhere, to school, to therapy sessions, to doctor's visits. Every milestone was documented, every struggle framed for an audience. While the public applauded her courage, privately, Jazz began to wrestle with internal doubts. Could a child truly consent to the long-term consequences of medical interventions? Did she fully understand the implications of halting her natural development, and later introducing hormones like estrogen to feminize her body? By 14, her body reflected that of a cisgender girl. Her voice had not deepened, her frame remained slight, and the outward signs of puberty had been carefully managed. But inside, Jazz was grappling with feelings that no prescription could address. Video diaries captured her raw emotions. I feel like I'm living a lie, she admitted at one point. I don't feel like me. For years, she had been portrayed as the ideal trans youth success story. Happy, healthy, confident, thriving. But in those private moments, she was confronting an existential unease that public acclaim could never erase. Psychologists have long debated the effects of pausing puberty, not just on the body, but on emotional and cognitive development. Puberty is not merely a series of physical changes. It is a critical period for identity formation, for understanding relationships, for learning to navigate social and emotional growth alongside peers. By freezing that process, had Jazz lost more than she had gained? Critics suggested that the very interventions designed to protect her identity may have also frozen her capacity to question, explore, and grow organically. Despite the cameras, the accolades, and the adoration, the quiet moments told a different story. Jazz was performing her identity under the unrelenting gaze of a national audience. Every emotion, every challenge, every achievement was scrutinized. The pressure to remain cheerful, articulate, and inspirational became unyielding. She wasn't just navigating adolescence. She was navigating adolescence as a prototype, a standard, a symbol for a movement. As her 14th birthday passed, the next step in her medical journey loomed. Cross-sex hormones. Estrogen would begin the process of feminizing her body, shaping her development to match her gender identity. On the surface, it seemed a continuation of the supportive path her family and doctors had charted. But underneath, Jazz's world was becoming more complicated. Her identity, her body, and her choices were increasingly intertwined with the expectations of the public, the media, and advocacy groups. Every procedure, every milestone was documented and celebrated. Yet every celebration also carried an unspoken pressure, the expectation to thrive, to succeed, to embody the perfect trans narrative. It was a burden that few could comprehend, let alone endure. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jazz began to feel its weight. The diaries became a lifeline, a place where she could articulate fears and doubts that had no place in the polished media narrative. She spoke of confusion, disconnection, and the loneliness of growing up under constant observation. For the first time, the image of Jazz Jennings, the resilient, brave, smiling child, clashed with the reality of her inner life, vulnerable, uncertain, and questioning. By freezing puberty and stepping into a carefully curated public identity, Jazz had gained the affirmation she needed, but at a cost. She had traded private exploration for public performance, curiosity for expectation. Every physical change, every medical milestone, every moment of self-discovery was filtered through the lens of visibility. And in that process, she was quietly losing the chance to simply grow into herself at her own pace. The tension between progress and personal cost, between support and pressure, would become even more evident in the years that followed. The path forward was medical, public, and irreversible. And as Jazz approached her mid-teens, the next chapter, gender confirmation surgery, loomed, promising both hope and an emotional storm that no one could have predicted. By the time Jazz Jennings was 17, her journey had become a case study in early gender transition. Praised in medical circles, advocacy forums, and media outlets alike, she was a shining example of the trans youth movement's progress. On the surface, everything seemed to align. The medical interventions, the supportive family, the media spotlight. But behind the public acclaim, a far more challenging reality was taking shape, one that no one had fully anticipated. In 2018, Jazz underwent gender confirmation surgery, a procedure intended to construct a neo-vagina and affirm her female identity physically. It was heralded as a milestone, not only for Jazz personally, but for the movement as a whole. She was among the youngest individuals in the United States to undergo such a procedure, a fact that fueled headlines, social media posts, and celebratory interviews. The narrative was clear. Jazz had achieved what many could only hope for, a full affirmation of her identity, a life aligned inside and out. But reality proved far more complex. Years on puberty blockers had left Jazz with limited penile tissue, a necessary component for standard surgical techniques. Surgeons had to improvise, using skin grafts from her stomach to reconstruct what her body could not naturally provide. The procedure was delicate, high risk, and fraught with complications. Within days, Jazz faced inflammation, intense pain, and issues with healing. The surgery, intended as a culmination of her transition, became the start of a grueling medical odyssey. Multiple follow-up surgeries were required, each one compounding the physical and emotional toll on a young woman already carrying the weight of public expectation. Jazz's confession in later interviews struck a chord with audiences. "I feel kind of broken." Once known for her infectious optimism and unshakable confidence, she was now grappling with disassociation, emotional numbness, and a growing sense of detachment from herself. The bright-eyed child who had inspired millions was confronting a new reality, one in which medical interventions, public scrutiny, and the weight of symbolic representation had left her emotionally fractured. As the physical healing continued, another battle emerged: mental health. Jazz began withdrawing from social media, limiting public appearances, and isolating herself from the world she had grown up performing for. Weight gain followed, a visible symptom of internal turmoil. She would binge eat, consuming thousands of calories in a single sitting, using food as a mechanism to cope with anxiety, depression, and the lingering trauma of repeated medical procedures. Daily life became a struggle, Tasks most people take for granted, getting out of bed, brushing her teeth, attending therapy, felt overwhelming. Even with unwavering support from her parents, Jazz felt lost. Scenes on I Am Jazz captured moments of raw despair. A mother pleading with her daughter to love herself. A daughter staring blankly, unsure if she could even reach for that love. The once celebrated narrative of a thriving trans teen was crumbling, replaced by a portrait of a young woman quietly enduring immense emotional pain. Then came her academic detour. Accepted to Harvard University, an extraordinary achievement for any student, Jazz delayed enrollment, explaining, "I need time to heal." Fans were shocked. The image of a perfect, thriving trailblazer was at odds with the reality. She was struggling, isolated, and uncertain. This was no longer a story of unbroken success. It was the story of a young woman grappling with the consequences of living a life under constant observation, under relentless expectation, and under the physical toll of irreversible medical choices. By her early 20s, Jazz Jennings had begun speaking openly about the hidden cost of her journey. She admitted to feeling emotionally lost, disconnected from her body, and psychologically depleted. Her post-surgical complications, weight gain, depression, and social withdrawal painted a stark picture. The price of being a symbol was immense. Jazz's identity was no longer solely her own. It had been shaped, curated, and scrutinized by families, doctors, media, and advocates. The child who had become a movement had, in many ways, lost the chance to simply become herself. The public, once unconditionally supportive, now faced a dilemma. Activists and advocates struggled to frame Jazz's struggles within a narrative of progress, while critics and conservative commentators seized upon her challenges as evidence against early gender-affirming care. Clips were recirculated, headlines spun, and Jazz's story became a weaponized symbol in a culture war. Through it all, she remained caught in the middle, yearning simply to be understood as a person, not a statistic, not a case study, not a headline. Even her family, once presented as a united front, showed signs of strain. Jazz Jennings, the mother who had led the charge for visibility, advocacy, and media exposure, was increasingly frustrated, desperate to guide her daughter back from the brink. Episodes of tension on I Am Jazz revealed the difficult balance between love and control, support and pressure. Jazz Jennings, once the emotional anchor, seemed to retreat, leaving the dynamic between mother and daughter even more fraught. Jazz's siblings quietly observed, their concern muted by the machinery of advocacy and cameras. And yet, through all this, Jazz persisted. Despite the physical pain, the mental health struggles, and the isolation, she continued to speak about her experiences, slowly reclaiming her voice, even if it was quieter, more measured, and far more human than the public had ever known. Her story, once polished and emblematic of triumph, now revealed the costs hidden beneath the surface, the complications of surgery, the impact of early medical intervention, the pressure of public scrutiny, and the psychological burden of being a movement while still a child. By her early 20s, Jazz Jennings was no longer just the bubbly child who had captured the world's attention. She was a young woman facing the consequences of a life lived under unrelenting scrutiny. A life shaped not only by her own choices, but by the expectations of a movement, her family, and an audience that had grown up with her. The cameras had faded, the headlines had shifted, and for the first time, she could step back from the role that had defined her for nearly 2 decades. In 2024, Jazz began to reclaim her life quietly. She shared updates about mental health, weight management, and personal growth. The relentless political spotlight and media frenzy were gone, leaving space for introspection. She was no longer just a symbol or a poster child. She was a person exploring who she was beyond the narrative constructed for her. Slowly, she began rebuilding confidence, working on her health, and reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. Yet the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The multiple surgeries, complications, and years of public scrutiny had left lasting impacts. Jazz spoke openly about her ongoing struggles with mental health, depression, anxiety, body image issues, and the sense of disconnection that came from having every stage of her identity documented and analyzed. These were not just medical or social challenges, they were deeply human ones. The reality of living a life where private doubts could never remain private weighed heavily on her. The public, too, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Jazz Jennings, once celebrated as a flawless emblem of trans youth success, revealed the hidden complexities of her journey. Weight gain, post-surgical complications, emotional fatigue, and identity struggles all became visible in ways that challenged neatly packaged narratives of triumph. For many, it was a shocking, even painful reminder that no amount of advocacy or media exposure can protect a young person from the weight of life lived under pressure. Her family dynamics had shifted as well. The Jennings family had long been portrayed as a model of progressive parenting, united in their support and advocacy. Yet the reality was more complicated. Jeanette Jennings, whose fierce advocacy had guided Jazz's life and career, faced criticism for being overbearing, for prioritizing narrative over personal growth. The tension between mother and daughter revealed the delicate balance between protection and projection. Meanwhile, her father and siblings quietly navigated their own struggles, attempting to support Jazz without being consumed by the machinery of media and activism. Jazz herself began asking questions that no one had encouraged her to ask earlier. Who was she, independent of cameras, scripts, and the expectations of a movement? Could she reclaim her identity as a young woman first and a symbol second? In interviews and social media posts, she admitted the difficulty of untangling the person from the persona, acknowledging feelings of loss, confusion, and the long-term consequences of decisions made in childhood. "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore," she confessed, a haunting admission that captured the depth of her struggle. Her story is not a caution against being transgender. It is not a critique of identity. Instead, it is a stark lesson about the dangers of premature certainty, over-medicalization, and the way public narratives can overshadow personal growth. Jazz's experience shows what can happen when a child is made into a symbol before they are allowed to explore life privately, at their own pace and on their own terms. The world had celebrated her triumphs, the smile, the courage, the articulate confidence, but often ignored the human costs hidden behind them. The truth is messy, uncomfortable, and deeply real. Jazz's journey reveals the tension between advocacy and personal well-being, between public expectation and private truth. It forces society to ask difficult questions. At what point does affirmation become performance? When does support become pressure? And most importantly, what is lost when a child is asked to grow in the public eye before they have the chance to grow for themselves? Now, in her mid-20s, Jazz is slowly reclaiming agency over her life. She is focusing on healing, both physically and emotionally. She is exploring her identity outside of the camera's gaze, working to regain the autonomy that was always partly out of reach. She posts selectively, engages with fans honestly, and speaks openly about mental health, a subject she now prioritizes above public acclaim. And yet, even in this quieter phase, the lessons of her story echo loudly. Jazz Jennings reminds us that every life has unseen costs, that the narrative of progress can obscure the individual struggles it seeks to celebrate, and that childhood is fragile, especially when it is made into a public spectacle. She is no longer simply a trailblazer for a movement. She is a young woman learning to navigate herself, her body, and her emotions in real time, in private, and with authenticity. The haunting question remains, what happens when a child becomes a movement before they have even learned to become a person. Jazz Jennings' story offers no easy answers, only a profound reminder of the complexity of identity, the weight of expectation, and the human need for space, growth, and autonomy. As the cameras fade, the media moves on, and the debates continue, Jazz Jennings persists, not as a symbol, not as a headline, not as an ambassador, but as herself. And in that quiet reclamation, perhaps there is hope. Not the shiny, celebratory kind that captivated millions, but the kind born from honesty, resilience, and the courage to rebuild life on one's own terms.